the same time, we're the ones who are most conditioned to try and protect our the walls of our silo, because we're convinced that we'll lose our independence or we'll lose our objectivity. And I argue in the book that that's nonsense, because independence is impaired only if someone is forcing you or prohibiting you or precluding you from doing something. If you choose to do that on your own, I argue that it's not an independence issue. It might be an objectivity issue if you had to go back and do subsequent work there, but look, we're smart enough to build safeguards around that.
This episode is brought to you by Greenskies Analytics, an audit analytics service provider that works with internal audit departments that have data analysts and are still frustrated with trying to make analytics actually work, aren't getting the expected ROI, who can't break through the communication barrier between the analysts and the audit team, and those that need experienced direction for an audit analytics strategy and process. Those that feel like they've wasted time and money on trainings, aren't getting the value they want, not prioritizing the highest risk areas for the organizations, or have projects that seemingly never get completed. Do you deal with any of that? If you do, go to the show notes of this episode and click the Greenskies Analytics link, or go to greenskiesanalytics.com to schedule a call and understand how Greenskies Analytics makes analytics actually work for internal audit.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of the Audit Podcast. I'm your host, Trent Russell, and today on the show, we have Richard Chambers. He is the former CEO and president of the IIA and current senior advisor over Risk and Audit for AuditBoard. Largely, topic of conversation is connected risk, based on Richard's latest book titled Connected Risk: Conquering the Perilous Risk Exposure Gap. And so a few things we hit on. If you're not familiar with the term connected risk, then we're going to hit on that for you. And then also any takeaways that Richard has heard from folks that have read the book that maybe he wasn't expecting. The way Richard sets the book up, and I say this at least once, I know during the episode, is he leads each chapter or most chapters with a question that he then goes on to answer in greater detail in the chapter or in the book at large. And so that's kind of how we talk about the book in general. So a couple of those questions being, how can risk management evolve to meet the needs of this new reality of 20th century ERM? When a significant disruptive risk event occurs, how can we plan for the downstream impacts? And then how can you, i.e. us, how can we embrace connected risk to achieve greater cross-functional collaboration and alignment? So that last one was largely like, hey, in audit, what can we do to basically spread the message and to make sure that this thing actually works when it comes to connected risk. With that said, there is a link to the book in the show notes. If you are not a book reader, and obviously this is a podcast, relatively short form, so we don't go into all the details that are really necessary. So again, if you're not necessarily a book reader, I would highly recommend subscribing to the blogs or periodically searching for the term connected risk and staying up to date on what's going on there, because it is, you will be kind of on the forefront. And so I think it's significantly better for us to go ahead and raise these issues and a connected risk initiative, if we want to call it that, now, as opposed to a year and a half from now going, oh yeah, I heard about that on this podcast and never broached the topic with anyone else outside of maybe internal audit or maybe not even beyond that or within that. So with that said, highly recommend whatever your preference for consuming and learning, whatever that is. I would put connected risk as a topic atop that and go check it out and learn more about that. With that said, here we go. I know you just got back recently from the AuditBoard user conference, so maybe it's something related to that, but what is in your either your internet browsing history or your ChatGPT history as of late? What have you been looking into?
Well, I just today worked on a blog, and I was sort of running some of the concepts past ChatGPT. I'd already put it together. It's on the art of deceiving an audit committee, and it talks about how a lot of deception of audit committees is not an act of commission. In other words, that people don't go out of their way to lie to the audit committee. It's act of omission, what they don't tell them. And so I was doing some searching around it. I did, by the time you air this, I'm sure the blog is going to have been around the block a few times. But that was some of my search history, some of my browsing history. And I even asked ChatGPT for a little feedback.
I think the interesting thing to me there is when we talk to audit committee chairs and CAEs and ask about their relationship and like, what do you want from each other? The number one answer every single time is, especially from the audit chair, is I want to know what I need to know like right away, and just I want full transparency. I don't want to jump into a call and be taken off guard by something. So
yeah,
the omission.
That's always been. I've asked the same question over the years 100 times, and more often than not, the answer comes back in 2 words: no surprises.
Yeah, that's it.
So it
no
sounds
surprises.
like exactly what you're hearing.
Yep, exactly. All right. All right, so relative to topic at hand, the latest book, and talking about connected risk, rather than just say, because connected risk is still fairly new. I know I went into LinkedIn and just typed in like the hashtag connected risk, and I didn't see anything within maybe the past like 6-8 months is kind of when it started. But rather than say, hey, like, what is connected risk? What I'd rather you do is like give us an example, if you could, of a connected risk relative to how it fits with the 3 lines model. Does that make sense?
Sure. Well, so first of all, thanks a lot. My book just came out, and very excited about it. It's top seller on Amazon, and so anytime I can put something together that people think help them and that they find they have a connection with connected risk, then I feel validated in terms of the amount of time I put into it. So it was a project that I've been working on since the beginning of the year. But look, connected risk is simply another way of describing a cross-functional approach to risk management. We've all grown up in our respective silos, whether it's internal auditors and doing their thing, and risk managers and compliance and InfoSec, and of course first line management. Everybody has been laboring away in their respective silos for the last 20, 30 years. And what I really talk about in the book is that the 2020s have rendered that approach obsolete, and that we really have to reach across to our colleagues, in fact, break down those hardened silos and start working more closely together. It doesn't mean we dumb down or abandon the unique purpose and unique expertise of all the key players. What it says is, together we are stronger than I, basically. It's about recognizing that if risk management doesn't collaborate with internal audit, doesn't talk to internal audit, the same thing with compliance, there's a much higher risk of surprises, unpleasant surprises like we've been seeing over and over.
Just like we talked about with the audit chair, no surprises.
Right. Absolutely.
And I believe in the book, I think you do like hey, if first line doesn't talk to second line, here's what could happen. If first line doesn't talk to third line, third to second, second to first, et cetera. And so you give those examples, Which I thought was really great. And the other thing I wanted to point out, this seems like the first, I don't know, maybe third of the book, there's a lot of data points, a lot of, hey, from this poll, we gathered this, from this poll, we gathered this. And I know there's some conversation in the book also on basically selling this idea. I think being able to use, obviously, what you wrote specifically in that section is helpful, but then there's just so many good data points in there where you can go, look, 54% XYZ, 89% XYZ, and that's why we need to move forward with this. So there's a lot of good, I think the trouble I feel like a lot of folks can have with a new concept like this is basically selling it, not monetarily necessarily, but selling it and getting buy-in across the organization, which is paramount, I would say, in this. And looking forward to connected risk. I think you do a really good job of doing that. Is there anything, I think the book's only been published as of today, like 7 or 8 days.
Yeah,
so maybe not, but how's that?
Been out for a week.
A week. So maybe not enough people publicly have been able to read it and talk to you about it, but I know you were at the AuditBoard conference, so maybe some folks did. Is there any takeaways that you're hearing that you didn't expect? Similar to how, like, you might post about something on LinkedIn and you think it's about this topic, but then in the comments, people take like one sentence and then blow it out and you go, well, that's not really the point I was trying to make here. But so has there been any unexpected almost feedback or takeaways that you've heard so far?
I'd say, Trent, the thing that surprised me the most is just how sort of universally well received the message has been. I haven't had anybody either publicly or privately sort of saying, oh, this is Pollyanna stuff. We can't do this. We'll sacrifice our independence, or we don't talk to each other for a reason. None of that kind of stuff. I do appreciate that some industries, particularly financial services, you've got regulators looking over your shoulder, and they're a little more sensitive to anything they think might be going on that would compromise internal audit's independence or objectivity. But even, I talked about it last week to a group of financial services chief audit executives, and there was widespread appreciation for the message there. I think this is an approach whose time has come. 10 years ago, when we were fully ensconced in the era of 3 lines of defense, people were maybe a lot more sensitive to being perceived as letting their guard down. But I think what we have come to appreciate in the first half of the 2020s is that emerging risks are coming at us faster than ever. There's more risk volatility. It's harder to predict what's going to happen. Companies are being literally decimated by risks, but at the same time, other companies maybe use that same risk as an opportunity to create extraordinary value. And if all your risk management players are kind of hunkered down in separate spaces, it really doesn't help the organization either protect or enhance value in this environment.
I appreciate the risk versus opportunity line. It's one that I've been preaching for a while. Also, like, we talk about risk all the time, and especially at a executive or board level, like, yeah, of course they know, but they would much rather hear, hey, here's opportunities rather than here's a risk. But they're sort of the same. But that's the way I've tried to look at it also. And I when I was going over my notes from the book, you mentioned that also, something about let's talk opportunity rather than risk, or, I'm kind of paraphrasing there. I just highlighted it and just note to myself said, thank you, Richard.
Yeah.
Well, an exclamation point, because I feel like there's not enough of that conversation that's going on.
Yeah, I in one chapter I talk about the attributes of connected risk thinkers. So how are people who really thrive in this idea, in this approach to collaboration and coordination and communication across the line, how are they wired? What's in their DNA? And I talk about that they inherently understand that risk is the flip side of the opportunity coin, or vice versa, and that organizations don't exist to just preserve value. They exist to achieve objectives, which inevitably includes value creation. And if you are afraid to take chances, if you're afraid to assume any risks, it's going to really minimize, if not negate, any chance of creating value.
Yeah, perfect. We were talking before, and I told you one of the great things about the way you set the book up is you ask the question in the book, in a given chapter, and then you go on to say, we're going to answer that in the next chapter, or we're going to answer that throughout the book, which, as someone who has to formulate questions from a book to then ask the author, makes it extremely easy for me. So I'm going to read this quote, and then actually, I think it's the full kind of, it's not a paragraph, a couple sentences, but in there it says, 20th century ERM redefines the value proposition of risk management by elevating its focus from the tactical to the strategic. The question we will strive to answer together in this book is, how can risk management evolve to meet the needs of this new reality? So I know that's like, broadly what the book is about, and so I don't want you to give it all away, basically. I don't think that's necessarily fair. But I'll throw that question to you. How can risk management evolve to meet the needs of this new reality?
Well, I think what I try and strive to reassure everyone, because look, we all, whether we're internal auditors or risk managers or compliance or InfoSec, we're all very proud of our professions, of the work we do, and we feel like we have a pretty unique set of skills and a unique purpose that backs up what we do, and that is absolutely true. And I argue that has to be validated, it has to be respected, it has to be embraced. But here's the point I make in the book. We may all have a unique purpose. We may have unique skills, but we have a common goal, and that is to ensure the success of our organization. So we can all be independently successful, but our organization may fail. In which case, I would argue that none of us were successful. So what I'm trying to assert with the book is that for the sake of your organization, you've got to do a better job of working together. It's a little bit analogous to a ship that's out in the North Sea where you got icebergs. Think Titanic era, right? If everyone is in their own cabin, kind of looking out the peephole to see if they see an iceberg on the horizon, you're much more apt to miss it than if everybody comes out of their cabins, goes up to the deck, joins forces, and looks in all directions. So to me, that's the analogy that I try to build on here in the book, is that together, as I said earlier, together, we're stronger than me.
Another direct question from the book that you then later go on to answer is, when a significant disruptive risk event occurs, how can we plan for the downstream impacts? So how can we plan for those downstream impacts?
Well, I think that's, again, part of the value that can come from putting our heads together and considering what have we seen before? What does experience indicate? What does our research tell us? I don't know that any of us, well, first of all, none of us really saw COVID coming until it was right in our face. But then I don't think we were thinking in terms of, okay, a year from now, 2 years from now, what is the second and third order effects of this going to be? I don't know that you could have even predicted some of it, but look, I mean, we could see pretty early on in COVID that government fiscal policy was pumping a ton of money into the economy to try and prop it up. In fact, to potentially save it. So it doesn't take an economist to understand that if government is pumping a lot of money into the economy, when there is a recovery, it is a very high risk that recovery is going to overheat the economy, in which case then you're going to have inflation, you're going to have supply chain disruption, shortages, you're going to have talent shortages, all of the things that come with an overheated economy. We could have anticipated, because those are essentially the second and third order effects of COVID itself. And so every time a major risk disruptive event comes along, we should obviously be thinking, how do we navigate through this? But we better be looking further out, because the consequences, we're still dealing with the consequences of COVID, not the health consequences so much, although those are still around, but we're still dealing with consequences of COVID 5 years after the onset. So this is the mindset I think that we have to adapt to in the second quarter of the 21st century.
I think you called because of your experience, I think you'd said, I know I'd heard in one of your sessions before, I think it was at AuditBoard Beyond last year, maybe 2 years ago, basically around inflation, because you were around when there was high inflation 30, 40 years ago.
40 years ago, yeah.
So you kind of saw some of that coming and spoke to it then. And I guess if we make a connected
risk. I don't
risk,
know that I necessarily, I was no more clairvoyant than anybody else, really. I don't know that I necessarily saw it coming, but when it came, I kind of thought, all right, I've seen this picture before, and I didn't like the ending. So I said, hey, to all of my colleagues out there, if you've never tried to audit in a highly inflationary environment, here's some things to think about. Cost containment, escalation provisions in contracts, all kinds of things that we don't normally think about, or we haven't for decades, because we haven't had an overheated economy.
Yeah, well, I appreciate your humility there, because I would have been like, yeah, I totally saw this coming. I called it before. Mid-COVID, I was the first one preaching about inflation risks or something. So bully for you there. All right. Last one relative to the book is, you said that the most pressing items on our agenda, i.e. in the book, is how can you embrace connected risk to achieve greater cross-functional collaboration and alignment? So how can we do that? Is it largely just education and communication, or like what can we actually do to make this work? I feel like we're going to talk about it for a long time. Different talking heads will mention it also, and then eventually maybe it'll gain traction. But like, what can we actually do? If there's a first step to be done, Again, knowing that this is the audit podcast, so it's largely auditors, although we do have risk management, et cetera, on there. What can they actually do?
Well, I think, first of all, there has to be common aspirations across the lines to enhance the overall effectiveness of all of us, right, collectively. And so if you can get that, and maybe, somebody's got to be the one to kind of pull out the flute and start trying to get everybody to follow them, right? So I think what we ought to be thinking about is internal audit often pairs up with risk management. And I think the statistics would indicate as much as 40% of the Fortune 500 internal audit functions have risk management responsibilities. So the internal auditors, and in healthcare, for example, it's not uncommon to find the chief audit executive also being the chief compliance officer. So I think there tends to be more crossover between internal audit and the others than maybe they are between themselves. So to me, we are a natural champion, and yet at the same time, we're the ones who are most conditioned to try and protect the walls of our silo, because we're convinced that we'll lose our independence or we'll lose our objectivity. And I argue in the book that that's nonsense, because independence is impaired only if someone is forcing you or prohibiting you or precluding you from doing something. If you choose to do that on your own, I argue that it's not an independence issue. Might be an objectivity issue if you had to go back and do subsequent work there, but look, we're smart enough to build safeguards around that. So back to your question, I think that internal audit should be the ones to pull out the megaphone and rally the forces to start down a connected risk journey. But everybody's got to be all in, and you got to have a real passion for the outcome. In the book, I outline sort of the phases, the maturity model, if you will, for connected risk, and the first one is just, there's a little bit of communication. Maybe I tell you that I did a risk assessment, I send you a copy of it. If you're in risk management, well, that's a start, but it's not nearly as valuable as if maybe we go together when we do interviews. If we're interviewing somebody in the C-suite and I'm asking them what's keeping them awake at night, you go in a week later and ask them the same question. That's frustrating for them, and we don't really get the benefit of hearing the same thing. So I think that starts to take us from some communication to maybe some coordination. Yeah, we're gonna coordinate when we do these interviews, and then finally you move to collaboration and ultimately to connection.
Okay, yeah, I like that string of the path to get there. That was great in a really concise way. Also, the way you closed it out there. All right, my goal usually with these, when it comes to someone who's written a book, is to try to get something that's not in the book out of the author. So that's what we always talk about, like what are you surprised you're getting asked about that's not in the book? And then obviously if it's a new concept like this, to talk about it at some kind of high level to get an understanding, the audience can go, yep, okay, that's what that is. I believe in that. We need to pursue it further. And then obviously highly recommend folks go check out the book. With that said, you have the stage, Richard. Close us out. What do you want to leave the audience with?
Well, what I hope is that that the audience, the people out there who may pick the book up and read it, recognize that if there's anyone who's invested in the traditional methodology of internal audit, it would be someone like me. 50 years in the profession. I came in at a completely different era, completely different time. I've been there through the evolution of the last half century, and I'm out there coaching and urging people to be more innovative, to embrace transformation to an even greater extent for the future. Because if there's been one constant over the 5 decades that I've been in this profession, it has been that the profession has not been afraid of change. And so I think we're up for it. And I encourage everybody who's watching the podcast, whether you read the book or not, to continue to look for opportunities to get stronger, to get better, to be more effective in serving your organization.
Hey everyone, thank you very much for listening to this episode of the Audit Podcast. Whatever platform you're listening on right now, I'm sure there's a subscribe button somewhere, so please hit the subscribe button there. If you're listening through iTunes or Spotify, feel free to go give us that 5-star rating. It only took me about 16 seconds to give myself a 5-star review, and it really helps to get future guests to come on the show, so we'd really appreciate that. Lastly, be sure to check out the show notes and follow us on all our social media channels on Instagram, on LinkedIn, and on TikTok. Also, if interested, please sign up for our weekly newsletter from the Audit Podcast. Thank you all. Have a great one.